Well, good day, everybody, and a hearty welcome to this webinar, this very, very timely webinar. Um, we are waiting for the room to fill up, but it is happening as we speak. So to not keep people waiting, we will kick off. Thank you very, very much for joining us. This is an ILC, International Longevity Center webinar in partnership with the International Longevity Center Global Alliance Climate Change Committee, a mouthful, and the Government Actuaries Department in the UK. My name is Rayne Stroebel. I am from South Africa, as I'm sure you will notice by the accent. I am a professor of practice at the Northwest University Optentia Research Unit in aging and intergenerational studies, with a specific interest in people living with neurocognitive impairment. We have a wonderful panel to guide us through this webinar today. Experts in their field, and we look forward to hearing what they have to say on this topic. I want to just kick off by saying that a warming planet and an aging population are the same story told in two different tenses. One, a crisis of what we are taking from the future, and the other, a crisis of who will be left to carry it. We have Georgina Bedenham, the head of climate and disaster risk from the UK. Welcome, Georgina. She's at the UK's Government Actuaries Department, where she leads work helping governments and public sector organizations understand and manage the risk and opportunities arising from climate change. She has worked on a range of climate resilience, sustainable finance, and risk management projects in the UK and internationally. Georgina also co-hosted GAD's Climate and Health Group and has a particular interest in the impacts of climate change on health and well-being. Welcome, Georgina. Then we have Professor Liat Ayalon, clinical psychologist and professor at the School of Social Work. Professor Ayalon is currently funded by the European Research Council to reduce ageism in the second half of life. She's also funded by the Israel Science Foundation to study intergenerational relations in the context of climate change, and by the Volkswagen Foundation in collaboration with colleagues in Germany, Dr. von Kutzleben and Professor Sweda, to study moral dilemmas in migrant home care arrangement. This is a very, very relevant topic. Moral dilemmas in migrant home care arrangement. Leah is also funded by the Binational Science Foundation in collaboration with Professor Carr to study social integration in the age of climate change, and by the ISF DFG funding mechanism in collaboration with Professor Rothermund to study descriptive versus prescriptive age stereotypes. Fascinating work. Then we have Professor Torsten Kleinow, Director of Research Center for Longevity Risk at the University of Amsterdam. Professor Kleinow is Professor for Longevity Risk. His primary research interests include mortality modeling and the analysis of socioeconomic disparities in life expectancy. He has published in international peer-reviewed journals and contributed to several international research projects on mortality and longevity. And then we have, at the end of our panel discussion, we will have a reflection from Rafiq Islam Khokann, who is the founder and executive director in Rupantar, Bangladesh. He is the, as we said, founder and executive director of Rupantar since the organization's formation. He carries 38 years of experience in the development field in various sectors in Bangladesh. His development work started as a direct activist, popular writer on different social issues of communities, and long-standing research on the world's largest mangrove forest. We look forward to Rafiq's reflection at the end of the panel discussion. So we then have set the stage. I really look forward to conversations, and we kick off with Georgina.
Great, thank you very much, Rayne. And good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. I'm Georgina Bedenham, and I lead our climate and disaster risk work at the Government Actuaries Department, or GAD. Today I'm going to talk about why climate change should be viewed as a compounding risk and why that matters when we're trying to understand future health and mortality outcomes. Climate change doesn't simply create new risks, it amplifies existing vulnerabilities and interacts with wider social, environmental and economic pressures. And as a result, understanding future health outcomes becomes increasingly complex. So in this presentation, I'll briefly introduce GAD, explain some of the direct and indirect ways climate change affects health, and then share a systems mapping project that we've been undertaking to better understand how climate change may influence mortality in the UK. And although our work focuses on the UK, many of the concepts are relevant globally, and I hope they provide a useful lens for thinking about climate and health in different contexts. So before discussing the project itself, I'll briefly introduce GAD. So we're a UK government department that provides impartial actuarial and analytical advice across the public sector. Within the UK, we support central government, devolved administrations, local authorities, and wider public sector organisations. But also internationally, we work with overseas governments and organisations including the World Bank. Many people associate actuaries with pensions and insurance, and while that's certainly a big part of our work, our broader role is to help decision makers understand uncertainty and navigate long-term risks. Climate change is increasingly important in that context because it has implications for health, mortality, pensions, public finances, and long-term resilience. We're also a multidisciplinary organisation, so we bring together actuaries, analysts and specialist consultants, and that multidisciplinary approach has been particularly important for the work I will discuss today. If we can move on to the next slide and move on one more. Great. So this slide illustrates some of the many ways that climate change can affect health outcomes. Many of us are familiar with the direct impacts. So extreme heat can cause dehydration and heat-related illness. It's estimated that heat-related mortality in England alone will cost £14.7 billion by the 2050s. And just today, the UK Health Security Agency published a report showing that there were 2,877 excess deaths in England caused by the May and June heat waves that we had over here in the UK, representing a significant increase on the excess deaths observed in summer 2025 last year. Poor air quality can worsen respiratory diseases as well, and flooding and storms can cause physical injuries. But they can also have a significant impact on mental health through displacement, stress, and disruption to people's lives. And climate change may also alter patterns of infectious diseases and affect food and water safety as well. And importantly, the impacts can vary by geography. So in the UK, as I've mentioned, we've already seen temperatures exceed 40 degrees for the first time in 2022, and we've had a successive series of heat waves this summer, demonstrating that climate hazards previously thought unlikely are becoming increasingly relevant. But different countries will obviously experience different combinations of risks and vulnerabilities. And then if we just move on once more, the indirect impacts are often just as important. So climate change can disrupt the systems that support healthy lives. Climate change can damage infrastructure that supports healthcare delivery. Around 10% of hospitals in the UK are located in areas at risk of high risk of flooding. And climate impacts are expected to negatively affect economic growth and therefore public finances, and potentially influencing future healthcare spending and capacity. Climate-related disruption to agriculture and supply chains can affect food prices and food security. The UK, for example, imports almost half of its food, and climate risks increasingly affect those international supply chains. And finally, climate change may also influence migration patterns and population displacement, creating wider societal challenges. And what makes all of this difficult is that these impacts don't occur independently. They interact through feedback loops and interconnected systems, creating compounding effects that are often difficult to capture through more traditional approaches. And this complexity is what led us to explore systems mapping. So if we just move on once more again, please, thank you. So for those unfamiliar with systems mapping, it's essentially a way of visualizing how different parts of a complex system interact with one another. So systems mapping can be a very valuable and powerful tool in how it can identify relationships, dependencies, and feedback loops, which might be missed through more traditional approaches. And we wanted to look at systems mapping to help us better understand the pathways linking climate change and mortality. So a key principle of systems thinking is that changes in one part of a system can have consequences elsewhere, and sometimes in ways that aren't immediately obvious. And it was therefore important to take a collaborative approach and bring together a diverse group of stakeholders, including expertise from public health, healthcare, climate and environment, alongside actuarial expertise to capture a broad range of perspectives. We also wanted the map to be robust and evidence-based, and the pathways included were informed by academic literature, publications, and expert input. And ultimately, the map provides a structured and holistic way of thinking about the main pathways through which climate change may ultimately affect mortality in the UK, and the assumptions, dependencies, and uncertainties associated with climate-related mortality risks. And if we move on to the next slide. So before anyone tries to read all the boxes and arrows, please don't worry, this wasn't the intention. This is just to show you the resulting systems map. And the main message here is not the detail, but the complexity and the interconnectedness of the system. So the map brings together direct climate hazards, such as extreme heat, alongside indirect societal impacts and transition-related effects within a simple single framework. So at the centre is mortality in the UK, and surrounding it are the main pathways through which climate change may ultimately influence mortality. So we looked at high-level determinants of mortality, such as lifestyle factors and emerging diseases, and then explored the factors influencing those determinants, such as diet, occupation, and living conditions. And finally, we looked at how climate connects into those pathways. So for us, the value of this systems mapping is that it provides a structured way to think about interactions, and it provides a foundation for future analysis, scenario development, and research into climate-related mortality risks. To illustrate that, if we move on to the next slide, I'll zoom into one part of the map. So we've just cut into one part of the map here. And if we look at this single node, and we look specifically at education, which is in the light pink box here, so education probably isn't something most people would immediately associate with climate-related mortality, but that's exactly why systems approaches can be helpful. So what we found is that education connects to a surprising number of pathways. For example, extreme high temperatures can disrupt education by reducing cognitive performance and learning outcomes, and causing school closures and therefore lost days of learning. And similarly, flooding may cause direct physical damage to school buildings, transport disruption, and school closures, and thereby disrupting education provision. And even the speed and the nature of a transition to net zero may influence educational outcomes through impacts on public spending and economic conditions. And education also links to a range of broader determinants of health, including lifestyle choices, socioeconomic outcomes, access to opportunities, and access to healthcare. And those factors ultimately influence mortality. So the important point here is not that necessarily education is the most significant pathway, but rather it demonstrates how climate change can affect health outcomes through routes that are far removed from the original climate hazard. And without that systems perspective, many of these connections could easily be missed. If we move on to the next slide. So in terms of our next steps for this project, we are still evolving the project. Our immediate priority is to finalise and publish the systems map and continue raising awareness of climate health interactions through events such as this. One of our key motivations at GAD is improving the way climate considerations are reflected in actuarial analysis. And in particular, we're interested in understanding how climate change might influence future demographic, mortality and morbidity assumptions used within climate scenario analysis, pensions and public sector planning. We're also exploring opportunities to expand the map further, including adding adaptation and resilience measures, so that we can better understand which interventions may have the greatest impact. And alongside this, we're supporting further research into climate, mortality and morbidity, including work being undertaken by university students in this area. So ultimately, we hope this work supports better informed policy and analytical decision making by improving the understanding of the complex interactions between climate and health. So I'll just finish with three key messages, I think, from this. So firstly, climate change affects health through a much wider range of pathways than the direct physical impacts we often focus on. Secondly, many of the most important consequences arise through interconnected economic, social and public service systems. And finally, systems thinking provides a useful way to understand those relationships and supporting better long-term decision-making under uncertainty. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion later.
Thank you, Georgina. And yes, I think the message of the complexity comes across very strongly, and thank you for unpacking that for us in a very visual way. So our next presentation is by Professor Liat Ayalon, as I said, Professor of Social Work, looking at food insecurity, social cohesion, and migration among older persons in Togo. So Liat, thank you very much for joining us.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for putting together this webinar, and thank you also, Georgina, for giving such a good introduction to the topic. I will try to dive in and talk specifically about older persons in Togo in relation to climate change and its effect on them. You can move to the next slide, please. I have no conflict of interest to report. The study was funded by the Israel Science Foundation, and if you go to the previous slide, you would see that we've already published the first paper with our collaborators in Togo and also with one of my postdocs. And it was actually about some of the challenges that we have faced conducting research in Togo, but I'm not going to touch on the challenges. I will talk more about the findings. You can now move. Thank you. So basically what I will report on is a mixed method approach that we took. We actually identified through our collaborators in Togo, which was an NGO located over there, identified 90 older persons, half of them migrated because of climate change, and 50% of them remained in place. And we administered both qualitative in-person semi-structured interviews, but also surveys to understand their experiences. And you can move next to the next slide. Thank you. What we found was really a distinction between the way they described their past versus the present, and the past was really vividly described as having predictable rainfall, abundant harvest, and diverse food choices, whereas the present was characterized by irregular rainfall and very severe, devastating extreme events that also had substantial impact on their food consumption and availability to really use and produce different types of food. You can move to the next slide, please. When we compared the surveys that we administered to those who migrated versus those who did not, and again, it's a very, very small, non-representative sample, but what we found was that in general, there were very few differences between the older persons over the age of 55 who migrated and those who decided to remain in place. The one difference that was statistically significant was actually in relation to the social environment. And what we found was that migration provided no escape, and migrants actually reported the same devastating situation that non-migrants reported, but migrants actually had even fewer social connections compared to those who remained in place. You can move to the next slide, please. The past was described both by migrants and non-migrants as being more collaborative, more communal, and mutual respect, and large households living together and sharing, whereas the present was characterized by migration, either of the older persons themselves or of their children. And there was a sense of mistrust and growing individualism and fear associated with scarcity, basically. So social cohesion was really described as being hampered by the changes brought by the climate and the environment and the need to migrate. You can move to the next one. When we administered very, very short questions about their mental and physical decline, we found very high levels of physical decline and mental distress reported by older persons. And through the interviews, it became clear that at least some of the mechanisms responsible for physical decline was really the very intense daily heat that has been causing a lot of fatigue and high levels of dust that also have been responsible for respiratory infection. And again, the scarcity of food that resulted in forced consumption of non-preferred low-quality foods. In terms of mental distress, a lot of it centered around nostalgia for the past and severe anxiety about what the future will bring, as well as high distress driven by the grief for the changes in the environment that these people have seen. You can move to the next slide. The people that we spoke with also reported systemic void in the fact, basically, there was formal care available, but it wasn't really available to them. And this was due to geographic distance that really prevented many of them to access health centers. Also severe financial constraints, and the fact that, again, many of the caregivers, the adult children, have left the village to the city, resulting in a caregiving deficit. So even though healthcare services supposedly are present, they are unavailable. And this is despite the fact that this population really experiences more intense needs for healthcare services because of the changing climate and environment. You can move to the next slide, please. In the interview, the people that we spoke with were talking about really very concrete needs, both in terms of social protection that was described as pretty much absent for all the persons, and I'm talking about financial provision. Also, the fact that all the persons are not included in climate adaptation policies, and there is pretty much a disregard to their needs and to the fact that this is a particularly susceptible population. And again, the issue of healthcare and services and the fact that they are not really accessible to many of the people, even though on the paper they exist. You can move to the next slide. Thank you very much.
Rayne, you're on mute.
My apologies. Yeah, thank you very, very much for that. Reflects on very, very similar realities in my country. So thank you. Fascinating. So our next presentation is by Torsten Kleinow from the Research Center for Longevity Risk in Amsterdam. And the presentation is on the effect of heat waves on short-term mortality spikes, which is much stronger than the effect of environmental factors and cold spells. Torsten, thank you. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And yeah, welcome everybody. So I would like to speak about mortality in Europe, and in particular about the short-term mortality. So not so much about kind of annual maybe mortality rates or kind of life expectancy, but on the short-term association. So spikes in mortality, which we observe during heat waves, for example, but also maybe due to some other environmental variables or spikes and changes in other environmental variables. The reason we looked at this kind of short-term association is maybe if you just go back to one, I should mention, credit where credit is due. This is not just me who was working on it. It's based on research with my colleagues, Jens Robben and Katrien Antonio, who are also at the University of Amsterdam at the Research Center for Longevity. So going to the next slide, the reason we look into this kind of short-term association, why we think it's important to also consider what happens on a kind of daily, weekly basis to mortality, is that I always think of mortality as the most extreme and most unfortunate, so to say, adverse health outcome. Yeah, but if mortality is high for whatever reason, then most likely there's also pressure on hospital beds. There's also pressure on social services and so on, because people struggle with their health. And the most extreme outcome is, of course, the death of an increased number of deaths. So I think that's quite an important thing to look at. And there are different approaches to consider, the effect in particular of temperature on short-term mortality. And you might have heard of this concept of a minimum mortality temperature, which many researchers look at. So they look at a specific region, say at London, and say, well, at probably around 17 or 18 degrees, daytime temperatures, mortality rates are the lowest. And then they see how this kind of changes and how you get like a U-shaped curve. So if the temperature is very low, going away from that minimum temperature, you have higher mortality. If the temperature is very high, you also get higher mortality. We used a slightly different concept. I find that less convincing, this concept, because this minimum temperature, is never reached in summer, is never reached in winter. So we look at what is a normal temperature for the time of year and for the region we are looking at. And we divided Europe up into 550 regions. We look at what's called the NUTS3 regions. So that's a concept introduced by Eurostat. You have around 550 of those regions. You see them here on the map. And we looked at what would be the normal temperature in each of those regions. And then see when there's a difference, when there's a deviation from that normality, what is the effect on mortality? We did that with temperature, but we also looked at other environmental factors. So in particular, it's something like particle matters, but also at ozone levels, for example. We also looked at humidity, so at rainfall and so. We found, if we just go back to the previous slide, we found that temperature is really the one variable which affects short-term mortality the most. So everything else, all other environmental factors, in particular air pollution, they are important, and air pollution has a significant effect, we found. But temperature really dominates everything else. And it is in particular hot temperatures, so heat waves. Very cold spells in winter also have an effect on mortality, but again, it's less than it is for heat waves. So the strongest effect on short-term mortality of everything that we looked at is heat waves in the summer. And there are very significant kind of regional differences. We will come to that also on the next slide then. But what I want to say already is that France and Spain in the south and Italy, so in the south of Europe, this effect is the strongest. And I certainly didn't expect that. I thought, in these regions, temperatures are high anyway. People are used to it. So if there's an excess, they can cope with it. But that's not the case. We found that certainly in the south of Europe, the effect of these heat waves is the strongest on short-term mortality. We also found what is often described as the harvesting effect. So there is some evidence that a week with very high mortality, for example, due to a heat wave, is often followed by a period where mortality rates are relatively low. And this was by many people, they suggest, okay, this is because, the people who die during a heat wave are those who are already very kind of fragile. And therefore, these people die earlier, and then in the following week, mortality is low. I have a lot of problems with that argument, but I want to say we do find the effects, we do find kind of statistical evidence for this harvesting effect. So there is, on average, a trend that after very high mortality weeks, because maybe of heat waves or other events, we observe lower mortality in the following period. Okay, and now just as an example, maybe if we go to the next slide, as an example, we looked at scenarios, so we fitted a model into to all of these things and looked at the importance of each variables, and as I said, temperature dominates everything else. But we then also looked at two scenarios, so this is kind of like what-if scenarios in Europe. And we looked at a moderate heat scenario on the left-hand side and a severe heat scenario on the right-hand side. Now, the severe heat scenario is something with 12 degrees, so to say, temperature over normality. So an excess of 12 degrees over what's normal for the time of year and for the region. And also a week in which all days in that week are classified as hot, and how we classify them also very technical. You can look at the paper. But, this is on the right-hand side. And this looked to us very extreme in the sense we have only observed it once, so to say, in our sample. But, given recent experience, given this year, last year, maybe it's not so extreme actually anymore. But what you see on both maps here is that they look very similar. The Spain is very much affected, so these really dark areas here, and then the further north you come, the less is the effect of this kind of 12 degrees excess temperature. Now, the difference between the left and the right is actually in the scale. And if you look at the scale at the bottom here, the left only goes to a relative risk of dying of an extra 10%, while on the right, it's going up to 24%. So meaning that there is a 24% excess mortality. This is what we predict for the south of Spain if there is this extreme temperature scenario. Well, we've seen at the end of June in Amsterdam, that's where I was at the end of June, we've seen some very, very high temperatures, something like 37, 38 degrees, which for Amsterdam at this time of year is very unusual, very high. And we've seen an excess mortality then of around 15 to 20%, which is pretty much in this region here, which we would have predicted. Well, we didn't predict anything for the Netherlands because we didn't have all the data for the Netherlands that we needed, but we predicted that for the north of France and Belgium, and I will just extrapolate from there. But it's so to say the model is predicting the right thing in a sense that's we're quite happy about that. So we also have a bit of trust into what we see here. And the main message is it really matters. The temperature dominates everything else. And the south of Europe is the area in Europe where the effects of heat waves and of extreme temperatures are the strongest. That's all I wanted to say for now. You have the reference to the paper here at the bottom if you're interested. So it's published in the Journal of the Royal Statistical Society. And I'm looking forward to the two questions and the discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Torsten. Fascinating. And I would really encourage attendees participants to please put questions in the chat box. I'm sure there must be many questions. So please feel free to put your questions in the chat box and we will direct them. For now, I'd like to call on Rafiq to tell us what is your impression of this within the context of your realities?
Hello.
Hi, Rafiq. Yes, please go ahead.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you, Chair, Moderator, Honorable Guest, respected colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It is a really privilege to join you today to discuss a crisis that is no longer outside. That's no longer outside uh, our windows, but inside our homes. The growing challenge of extreme indoor heat for decades. We have told people to stay indoors during the heat waves. However, new evidence shows that for millions across South Asia, there is no safe escape because the danger has followed them inside. This is a matter of public health, social justice, and human dignity. I would like to discuss this issue through three interconnected truths: our challenging climate, our aging population, and the realities of inequality. First, climate change has entered our homes. Across South Asia, we are seeing more frequent heat waves, warmer nights, and expanding urban heat island. For poorer families living in the tin-roofed homes with poor ventilation, indoor temperatures stay dangerously high all night. Without proper cooling to sleep, the body accumulates heat stress day after day. This is slightly affects physical health, mental well-being, and survival. Second, our population is aging. This is a great development achievement, but it means we have a growing number of people whose bodies struggle regulate this temperature. Older people sweat less efficiently and often take medication that affect hydration. Therefore, climate policy and aging policy can no longer be treated separately. They are now deeply interconnected. Third, we must look at vulnerability through a gender lens. Older women face multiple overlapping risks. Many have lower income, limited pension, and caregiving responsibility that keep them indoors. In poorly ventilated kitchens, cooking in extreme heat is a daily hazard. They often delay seeking health care, increasing their risk of severe complications. Similarly, older men face distinct challenge. Many continue working in agriculture, construction field sites because they lack pension. They are exposed to direct sunlight and are often reluctant to stop working due to social expectation, responsibility, leading to unused heat illness. So what must we do? We must make indoor heat a priority in our National Heat Action Plan. We must identify older people as a priority group in disaster risk reduction and promote passive cooling in housing, such as reflecting roofing and improved ventilation. The voice of older women and men must be included in decision making. Their experience is not a burden, it's a resource for building community resilience. In conclusion, the successes of our development is measured not just by how long people live, but by how safety they can age in challenging climate. Extreme indoor heat no longer invisible problem. It's a public health emergency now. As government partners, we have knowledge and responsibility to act. Let us build climate resilience home, inclusive policies so that every older person can live a longer, healthier, and more dignified life. In the era of climate change, safe homes are not luxury. They are fundamental condition to human dignity. Thank you very much. Over to moderator and chairs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rafiq. Again, so much of your comments reflect on the reality of so many hundreds of thousands of people in South Africa, and I'm sure in greater parts of Africa as well, which is deeply, deeply disturbing to witness. So thank you very much, Rafiq, for bringing that perspective. Let's go to questions. There's a question for Georgina. When developing the system maps to assess the impact of climate change on mortality and morbidity, did you also consider transition effects? For example, climate transition is expected to substantially reduce air pollution. In the UK, PM2.5 concentrations have fallen by almost 75% since the 1990s and are projected to decline by a further 30% by 2050. Georgina, your thoughts on that?
Thanks, Rayne. Yes, so we did consider transition effects as part of the map, so they are included in there around, as you say, from the question, air quality, water quality as well, and also the cost of transition. So we are in the process of putting kind of directional, thinking through the kind of directional impacts and how it all intertwines. But the minute we're just kind of capturing the existing relationships. But yes, definitely the transition effects were considered.
Thanks, Georgina. And Torsten, a question for you, which I also have. I was in Amsterdam at the same time as you, and spending some time in Europe, which was excruciating, even for someone coming from South Africa. What would be your prediction for the increased mortality this year, considering these extreme conditions? And, not only the heat, but the pollution as a result of all the fires and everything that's happening at the moment.
Yeah, I mean the research that I've presented, we looked at short-term relationships, so it's not so much about annual mortality. And what I can say is that in those weeks in the Netherlands, we have seen an increase of mortality of around 20%. And to put that into perspective, so we've seen around 3,500 deaths per week in this 1 week of at the end of June, which compares to around 3,000, which we would have expected. So it's around 500 excess mortality, which is significant for a country like the Netherlands. That's a pretty high number. But again, to put it into perspective, in winter we would see between 3,500 and 4,000 deaths per week in January and February. That would be normal. In the summer, it would be maybe 2,500 to 3,000, and in that special week, it was 3,500. So it sits there in the middle, but it is a significant jump in mortality. Now, how would that translate into annual mortality? Well, it really depends on what happens to the rest of the year. If the temperatures stay reasonably normal, and so I wouldn't expect that to have a massive impact on annual mortality. Things like the influenza that we see every winter. The influenza season, how strong that is, has a higher impact on mortality than 1 or 2 weeks of heat waves. But as I said earlier, I don't just look at it from the number of deaths that we see in the year or so, or even the week. It is really more of an indicator for the general kind of a proxy for the general health of the population and what happens to the demand for hospital beds, what happens to the demand for kind of ambulances and medical responses and so on. So I cannot answer the question. I do not know what the annual increase will be. If that was the only week that we need to cover, or one of 2 or 3 weeks, maybe only, then the impact will be very small on annual mortality numbers.
Yeah, I also always think, we talk about mortality, but I think, and this is something that Rafiq also brought to the table, is the levels of distress that must be frightening. I know that in South Africa, and this is not even a heat wave, this is just in summer, like in India, we have so many people living in informal settlements, in informal dwellings. Rafiq, you mentioned a corrugated iron roof. I'm sure in India as well as in South Africa, we have, houses that completely consist of corrugated iron, where the daily temperatures get up to 49 degrees Celsius. And as you said, there is no escape from that. That is your escape. That is your shelter. The levels of distress for older people who are frail, is unthinkable. So Neil Daniels have a statement and a question that, he says, I assume there is a relationship with the duration of a heat wave, Torsten. For example, one day at 40 degrees, where is not such an issue, perhaps, but 2 weeks is worse. And this is why I also say, obviously there are definitions of what is a heat wave, but this could be average temperatures in a country like South Africa. Of course, in Europe, it's different, but and it also must relate to expected temperature. He says 40 degrees in Northern Europe is more unusual than in Southern Europe. So people are less able to cope, or there is more excess mortality. Is there evidence of a correlation here?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
There is, of course, evidence for a correlation. The longer it lasts, the worse it is. That's absolutely right. And we looked at that by, so to say, defining what, by using, in a sense, not a heat wave definition. So we don't just have a heat wave in a certain region, but we construct variables which reflect for how long high temperatures were there, how many days in the week we have seen really high temperatures, and how high those temperatures were relative to what is normal. So it's always relative to what is normal, which brings me to the second part of this question. Of course, in Northern Europe, the normal temperatures are lower than in the south of Europe, or maybe in South Africa. In the summer, temperatures in the Netherlands are not supposed to be higher than, say, 25, maybe, that would maybe be normal. And so if it then goes up to 40, also the difference is much higher in the north of Europe. So what we try to do is we try to look at what is normal for the region and for the time of year, and then relative to that, define what we mean with extreme temperatures for a day and how often it appears. Just as another example for this, I'm currently in Scotland. The official definition of a heat wave here is 3 days over 25 degrees. So I think we are okay with that. 3 days over 25 degrees in most parts of the world, that would not be a heat wave. That would be nice. Yeah. So it really depends on the region. I think we have to keep that in mind. But then relative to what is normal, an increase of 12 degrees, say, has a higher impact in the south than it has in the north. Yeah, and that surprised me, and I think also who asked the question, you might also be surprised to see that, but that's what we found. Yeah, the effect is worse. So the adaptation which you would think has taken place in the south of Spain or in Italy is not that strong, is not preparing people enough to keep with the extra 12 degrees, say, for example. Yeah, as an example.
Yeah.
So this is something, and yeah.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Torsten. I studied in Stirling in Scotland. I think we can do a webinar on the weather in Scotland.
Yeah.
So there's another question for you. Your analysis focuses on temperature, and this is something that I also find very interesting. But did you also examine the interaction between temperature and humidity?
Yes.
For instance, in coastal parts of Europe, humidity can substantially increase heat stress, even at the same air temperature. Given that wet bulb temperature better reflects the body's ability to cool itself through sweating, do you think it would provide a more accurate measure of heat-related mortality risk? Do you think incorporating it would change the conclusions on mortality risk?
Yeah, that's a good point, because we did not, so to say, really look at whether a region is close to the sea or not, and so that was less important for us. But we did include rainfall as a covariate. So we looked at extreme rainfall just as we looked at extreme environmental factors like air pollution, for example. So we included all of those, and we allowed for interaction effects. So this is all done through a machine learning model, and so which we allowed for interactions between the different variables. And they have an effect. I mean, there are these, but relatively small. Really, the thing that trumps everything else is high temperatures. That really has an immediate effect on people, and it has an effect throughout Europe. But you're right, we didn't look into how close to the sea, so we didn't take these kind of geographic features of a region maybe into account, where maybe how high they are and somewhere in the mountains or somewhere close to the sea. We didn't do that, but we did look at the interaction effects between different variables, and it turns out high heat, so high temperatures have a strong effect. They're also much stronger than, for example, very low temperatures, who have more of a delayed effect on mortality, actually. So yeah, I mean, for the details, I would really, encourage everybody to maybe have a quick look through the paper. There are lots of pictures in it, so maybe that also helps to get an idea of what we found without having to spend too much time on it. But it was very interesting, and what I found really most surprising is that the other factors have such a small effect only on short-term mortality. I mean, I should really emphasize that it's about short-term mortality. It's a spike, a change in variables in 1 week has an effect on mortality in that week and in the following week. That's what we looked at. It's not about a general increase in air pollution and how that affects people like that. I'm sure it does in places, yeah, but that was not the point of this research. The point of this research was short-term.
Thanks, Torsten.
Okay.
Fascinating work. Georgina, we have a question. Someone says, I understand your mapping work is in early stages and the advice will be broad and likely require long-term or systemic change. We would think so. But what practical advice do you expect you will provide to local authorities and like the NHS trusts? Perhaps things we could apply in the short term to help cope with the next heat wave we will surely experience in the next few weeks. That's for sure.
Thank you. Yes. So yes, obviously, I mean, the heat waves we're experiencing definitely sort of focuses the mind on things that we need to do to adapt to climate change. And that's definitely, in a lot of the conversations I've been having, it's clear events such as this really make people stop and think about actually, we need to do something now. So I think, I mean, a lot of our work at GAD is working with government departments, public sector organisations, in helping them to really think about both the physical impacts of climate change, the impacts of the transition to net zero, and thinking about the different climate scenarios we may face in the future, the different pathways, and the uncertainty that brings. So obviously we can't predict with accuracy what these future scenarios might look like, but they can, having that kind of, I suppose, thinking through the potential impacts in the future, how they might impact on the risks that your organisation is already looking at. So things like risk to service delivery, risk to your organisational objectives, and to strategy. That really helps with bringing forward some of the decision making around adaptation action that can be taken. And that's something that we've found very valuable in the conversations that we've been having with the organisations that we work with, is around sort of, I suppose, bringing forward some of those conversations and interlinking them with existing risks that the organisation are looking at, and actually thinking about some of the ways in which those risks are going to be exacerbated by climate change, and therefore having that renewed focus on what could happen in the future and how do we prepare for that. And it's obviously, as we're seeing in the UK, it's important to have those conversations early and adapt early so that we're prepared for those potential outcomes.
Thank you, Georgina. Final question for Liat. Something that I also wondered about is, did you find that the climate migrants were welcomed into their new communities? And would there be an argument for improving cohesion as a community resource? I would also be interested in how deep did you go into this relational aspect of the migration?
Yeah, so I think that actually what we found was that the one area that was most affected by the transition, not for the better, but for the worse, was social cohesion. So that those people who migrated actually were negatively affected and had smaller networks and less collaborative relations with their new neighbors. But we also found that those who stayed in place also were affected by migration because it's their adult children who moved. So either way, I think that people were highly affected by migration.
Yeah, which is again something that we see in South Africa as well. Even though migration to the mines have stopped, but we now have mass migration from country to country. We've just, I don't know, you would have seen on the news, had a huge xenophobic outbreak in South Africa, and people had to go back to Malawi or Mozambique or Zimbabwe, wherever they came from. And yeah, working the land at home, which for many older people is their primary source of wealth, where children then have to migrate, and the impact of drought on their wealth. It's such a complex and tragic situation. So I'm really interested to look more at the work. So we have to wrap up. There are still many questions, and I think where we started with Georgina, we can't overemphasize the complexity of this debate. But a huge shout out to ILC UK for the work that you do, for creating this platform. I think it is, well, we know it is time. Time is running out. But I really want to salute you for creating this platform. If anyone wants to participate more or become more involved with the International Longevity Center, please do contact them. I am the co-president of the International Longevity Center Global Alliance. We are always looking for interested parties to join this conversation. So please join us. A huge thank you to our panelists, to Rafiq. I think we got a very varied and global perspective on this issue. So thank you very, very much for your participation. Are there any? Yes, of course, we have to thank sponsors as well on the screen now. Without them, this would not be possible. Are there any closing remarks, Torsten, Liat, or Rafiq, or Georgina?
I just
Thank
want to
you.
say something.
Basically,
Go ahead.
Torsten?
Okay, yeah, thanks very much. I just want to say thank you for organizing this. It was very interesting for me to hear also the other speakers, and much appreciated. Thanks.
Thank you. Rafiq? Rafiq, you wanted to say something?
it's for us, and we hope we will be able to discuss in coming days. Thank you.
Thank you, Rafiq. Georgina?
Sorry.
Yes, just echo the rest of the panel. Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me to speak today, and it's been a really interesting discussion.
Liat, you shook your head. I assume you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I want to thank the team behind the scenes. There is a whole lot of organizational things happening behind the scenes. So thank you very much to everyone for making this possible. The recording will be available. And a great thanks to everyone for what I thought was a very, very interesting presentations and discussion. Thank you.